Today we need to have a listen to four-star General Harald Kujat, who has the inside information on the lead-up to the current conflict in Ukraine and beyond. Journalist and political commentator Glenn Diesen recently had him on his podcast, and this was what he asked.
Well, after the Cold War, there was great optimism about the relations between the West and Russia. Yet, now we're stuck in this proxy war in Ukraine, which can escalate to an actual nuclear war. How do you see the relations between Russia and the West going so bad over the past 30 years?
It is true that fundamentally, relations after the Cold War, and actually even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, between NATO and Russia, and at that time still the Soviet Union, improved. Great efforts were made, and in 1990, for example, there was already supposed to be a mutual exchange, a dialogue, and even a strategic partnership established between NATO and Russia. Russia actually sought closer ties with NATO, and then in 1991, with what was essentially the first strategic concept in NATO's history, a real new beginning was made. And this continued, of course, with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council, both on the political level, from ambassadors to defense and foreign ministers up to heads of state and government, and on the military side, of course, the chiefs of general staff, who met at least twice a year. A permanent Russian military representative was also present at headquarters with a small staff, and these meetings then took place at least once a month. I myself was also chairman of the NATO-Russia Council of Chiefs of Defense. Incidentally, which is often forgotten, in this role I was also chairman of the NATO-Ukraine Commission of Chiefs of Defense. So I had both sides sitting at my negotiating table. And of course, that also opened up new perspectives. Now, regarding the changes, it must be said that they actually began at the strategic level in 2002 with the termination of the ABM Treaty by the United States.
This is a very interesting piece of information. Notice it was the United States that withdrew from this important treaty, not the other way around.
A very important treaty. ABM stands for Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty. That was, so to speak, the complement to the Treaty on Intercontinental Strategic Systems, meaning on the one hand the offensive and then the defensive systems. This addition was intended to ensure nuclear strategic stability between the two nuclear superpowers, and Russia understood this as an attempt to gain dominance and superiority in this area. The political rupture then occurred in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where then U.S. President Bush tried, with considerable force, to push through an invitation for Georgia and Ukraine to become NATO members. That did not succeed at the time, but in order to save face, a perspective was included in the communiqué that Ukraine could eventually become a NATO member. And for me, these two events are actually the turning points in the relationship between NATO and Russia.
It's very interesting to hear the same perspective from yet another person of authority. We've heard Professor John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Aaron Mate, and others present this viewpoint. This statement simply reinforces what we have previously learnt.
I would like to add why that is. Russia's two most important strategic goals are first, to avoid a conflict with the other nuclear superpower, the United States. The second most important strategic goal for Russia is to avoid a direct military conflict with NATO, which basically also implies that a confrontation with the United States could occur. These two goals have always been dominant. As early as the mid-1990s, Russia repeatedly articulated this. And so I can say from personal experience that this was always evident in the discussions we had. Ultimately, this objective led Russia to try, during the negotiations on the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, to push for co-decision-making, that is, joint decisions on security risks for Russia or for NATO. Of course, that was not possible, because decisions of this kind can only be made by the member states. But we found a formulation that ultimately did establish a mechanism for crisis and conflict management, including the possibility, in certain situations and under certain conditions, to make decisions jointly. That is the crucial point. And this buffer zone, in which Russia assumed that in this buffer zone, that is, in the former Warsaw Pact states, including Ukraine, crisis conflicts could arise that could then lead to a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. That was the major concern. That is why a buffer zone was supposed to be established here, to prevent this. After NATO expansion, the focus naturally shifted to Ukraine. So in this war that is being waged here, Russia is trying to achieve exactly this goal, which they have been pursuing for decades.
Notice how incredibly consistent Russia has been on these issues for the better part of the past 30 years. Yet today, in the Western media, Russia is presented as the aggressor, despite evidence to the contrary.
When the Russians invaded in 2022, we embraced this narrative that it was unprovoked. This is quite an important narrative, because once we accepted that this narrative that the Russian invasion was unprovoked, it meant that any negotiations was seen as rewarding aggression and conquest. So the only path to peace was military victory, that is, defeating Russia. Do you agree with this assessment of the provocations and Russian motivations?
There are two arguments that are repeatedly mentioned. You named one of them. The war was unprovoked. The second is that it was supposed to be an all-encompassing war. That means Russia's goal is to conquer all of Ukraine. I want to address both aspects. Unprovoked. That's a question that can actually be answered relatively quickly, but I do want to elaborate a bit. This war has a long history, and Jeffrey Sachs recently spoke and wrote in great detail about this background, providing thorough reasoning. That's why I don't want to go into detail about it here. But one of the crucial points is the coup against the democratically elected Ukrainian President Yanukovych in 2014, followed by a civil war in eastern Ukraine, which was mainly fought between the Ukrainian army and the Russian-speaking population there. This had a lot to do with the fact that the civil rights of this Russian-speaking population were severely restricted. Then came Minsk II in 2015, and in this agreement, an attempt was made to find a solution to resolve this conflict. The core of this agreement is that these Donbass regions were granted a special status within the Ukrainian state, meaning they were allowed to speak Russian, practice Russian culture, and so on, and that this was to be codified in a constitutional amendment by the end of 2015. That was not done by the Ukrainian government. In fact, something entirely different happened. They began to modernize the Ukrainian armed forces, to rearm them, to increase their size again. We had significantly reduced them at the beginning of the century, and now they were being expanded again. As we all later heard from Ms. Merkel, who helped negotiate this agreement, and also from the then French President Hollande, the real intention was not to resolve this conflict, but rather to buy time in order to rearm the Ukrainian armed forces. That must be described as a clear act of deception. So I'll jump ahead to the year 2021. In December 2021, Russia then attempted to defuse this security situation through agreements on security arrangements, both directly with the United States and with NATO. Both sides rejected negotiations on this. At the same time, Russia tried to exert pressure by massing a large number of troops on Ukraine's borders. In other words, they were actually trying to create negotiating pressure. Russia did not succeed in this. On the contrary, the situation significantly worsened over the course of January and February 2022, and Russia then invaded. And now comes a crucial point. The question is always, what strategic goal am I pursuing with this? So, what was Russia's intention with this? And up to today, there have really only been two realistic opinions. One was that they wanted to increase pressure, not just outside Ukraine's borders anymore, but by occupying parts of Ukraine, and thereby forcing Ukraine to negotiate. I had a different view. My opinion was that Russia wanted to try to overthrow the Ukrainian government. In other words, to bring about a regime change, as it's called today, and install a pro-Russian government. That would have essentially avoided a war. Why do I believe this was their intention? For one thing, because the entire conduct of operations didn't allow for anything else. Around 170,000 Russian soldiers have effectively marched in, not in attack formations, but rather they have entered as an occupying force, so to speak, against a Ukrainian army of more than 400,000 troops, modernly equipped, as mentioned, modernized and trained by the West for 8 years. This means that occupying the entire country is not possible, neither in terms of the number of soldiers required for such an occupation, nor in terms of being victorious against the Ukrainian defenses. Secondly, strategic points were occupied, which were intended to ensure that a regime change could actually be carried out. That did not succeed. Incidentally, some time ago, Ukrainian President Zelensky confirmed exactly this in side discussions in Davos. He was supposed to be replaced by Medvedchuk, that is the former opposition leader in the Verkhovna Rada, who was supposed to become president and is considered pro-Russian. So this assessment or narrative that Russia supposedly carried out an unprovoked attack is not tenable. And the other claim, that Russia tried, or is still trying, as is sometimes asserted, to occupy the entire Ukraine, that is also not tenable.